The Tower of Babel, Genesis chapter 11. If you ask the average person what's the Tower of Babel story about, they'll probably say something like, it's about God scattering mankind by confusing their language. Or mankind was building a tower towards the heavens, and basically God didn't like that. Well, overall, that's correct, but maybe there's something deeper. To me, this story always stood out as different compared to the previous stories. Genesis starts with creation, then Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, Noah's sons, and of course, there's genealogies and covenants intertwined. And now we have a strange story about mankind making a huge tower to reach the heavens, and God isn't pleased. Let's read the text. Genesis chapter 11. The Tower of Babel. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Let's deconstruct the story by identifying its themes. In verse 2 it says, as people moved eastward. Now this is an interesting theme, east versus west. We know from the previous stories that Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden, and they were cast out in the east. Figuratively, when man is moving eastward, they're moving away from God. But when they're moving westward, they're moving towards God. Another interesting theme is this idea of baking. In the story, they say to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." Now this is interesting. In the NRSV Bible, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 19, God says, "By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread." But how does one make bread? You have to bake it. So instead of baking bread, they're baking bricks. And we know later on, Israel will later become slaves doing what? Baking bricks for Pharaoh. And these bricks were used to build storage and supply cities for Pharaoh, which ultimately expands his empire and his glory. We also see the concept of building a city. Who else built a city? Cain, after he's cursed in Genesis 4:17. And there's also the idea of scattering, judgment, God seeing, God saying something, and God correcting. In verse 3, we see a progression of baking bricks to build a city and ultimately a tower. But why a tower? It says a tower that reaches to the heavens. And what is their motivation? We see it in verse 4. It says, "So that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." So what should mankind be doing, building, or expanding? Well, let's go back to Genesis. God says, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it." Another way to say this is, we should populate and scatter across the globe. And in a perfect world, we would be expanding God's garden, the Garden of Eden. Note that God sees the progression of bricks to a city to a tower, but he doesn't destroy their industry of brickmaking, their city or their tower. The problem really lies within mankind and his motivation. God confuses us so that we're not united in open rebellion against his will for us. In verse 2, it says, "And they found a plain in Shinar." You'll notice in your footnote, Shinar means Babylonia. And in verse 9, the word Babel is similar to the Hebrew word for confuse. Now, if Babel means to confuse, and there's the land of Babylon with Babylonians that live there, you can view Babylonians as a confused people at the time, not necessarily intellectually confused, but spiritually confused. Later, after the kingdom of Israel, we can view Israel as a confused people when they are in exile in Babylon, the land of spiritual confusion. I like to view the story of Babel as a transition or a bridge. It bridges the old world of nature or the garden to the new world of industry, or one can say technology and cities. So, what does this story mean for us in our current state? Here's a few questions to think about. Are you in a spiritually confused land? And is that confusion affecting you in any way? Are you figuratively a slave, making bricks, building and expanding a confused city, advancing its empire? Now, if we're honest with ourselves, the answer to all of these questions is yes. Now, the real question is, what do we do about it? Just as a reminder, living in a city isn't necessarily a bad thing, but do know where you are and whose empire is being expanded, and especially what role you play in that expansion.